Welcome everyone to the Israel Institute for Advanced Studies. Can you hear me? No? Is it better now? Yeah. Okay. So welcome to the Israel Institute for Advanced Studies. And we are happy to host you here today for a special lecture by our special guest of the Institute, Jan Grabowski. But before I'll give the floor to Jan, there are some things we should remember. It is the 564th day since the gates of hell opened upon Israel and the Middle East. And 59 hostages are still in captivity. And we are before Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Day. And it brings lots of thoughts, although I think there is...
Can you move the microphone so we can hear you?
I think we can't really compare what happened on the 7th of October to the Holocaust, but thoughts are coming. And I must admit that after the 7th of October, sympathy was given to us in abundance. For as the writer Dara Horn pointed out in the title of her unsparing book, people loved Jews. Living one, especially should they have the temerity to defend themselves, not so much. There is rightly sympathy too for the Palestinians of Gaza and the West Bank, who are also victims and prisoners and do not deserve to be punished for the wickedness that was perpetuated by fanatical tyrants, nor for the delusion that the deaths of Jewish families will make Israel disappear. We do not disappear, but we do suffer. The great Columbia University historian Salo Baron spent his career investigating, fighting actually against the fatalists of what he called the lachrymose conception of Jewish history. I myself have made an effort to go with a positive and not describe the history of the Jews in the early Middle Ages as a veil of tears. Numerous historians in the past few decades have made a courageous effort to think about Jewish history with the human smoke of Auschwitz blown away by time and education. But this now seems an idle hope. From reports all over the world in the days following the massacre of the 7th of October, it is obvious that the spectacle of dead Jews can still excite rather than restrain anti-Semitism. And let it be said out and loud. Zionism is not the cause, but the consequence of perennial dehumanizing anti-Semitism. For more than a year, the Israeli academia is experiencing an unprecedented attack from so-called liberal thinkers and pro-Palestinian activists in academic circles all over the world. These, of course, did not emerge in a vacuum. And although these attacks are not motivated by anti-Semitism per se, they are certainly fueled by it, mostly under the guise of anti-Zionist and anti-colonial rhetoric. These people have no doubt that the truth and justice are on their side, whereas they simply confirm Jerome's, the 5th century Christian scholar, so they confirm Jerome's old saying that ignorance breeds confidence. Learning creates fear. And so by having Jan Grabowski today here, I would like to entice you to some fear. Thank you very much.
אני חושבת שהוא מופעל. Okay. Dear friends, dear Professor Jan Grabowski, it is with a true pleasure and honor to take part in this meeting dedicated to the Holocaust Remembrance Day and to Professor Grabowski's lecture, Bystanders of the Holocaust, History, Memory, and Commemoration. I have known Professor Grabowski for over, it's 25 years now, more or less, something like that. And during that time, I've come to deeply respect his scholarship and to admire his steadfast dedication not only to Holocaust studies, but to the pursuit of historical truth. Professor Grabowski, one of the world's foremost scholars of the Holocaust, was born and raised in Warsaw to his loving parents. His father is Zbigniew Richard Grabowski, formerly Abrahamer, a Holocaust survivor and professor of chemistry, and his mother, Anna Grabowska, a true intellectual. Both of his parents, who passed away in recent years, have had and continue to have a profound influence on his intellectual path. Professor Grabowski, or maybe I can pass now to Jan. Jan is one of those rare historians whose work constantly reshape our understanding of the Holocaust. Time and again, his research opens new avenues of inquiry and compels us to revisit familiar topics with fresh eyes. Let me just give one example. His seminal study, Rescue for Money, Paid Helpers in Poland, 1939 to 45, challenged common assumption about rescuers and bystanders, promoting an ongoing and sometimes intense scholarly debates, and maybe we will hear more about it later on. One of his most important contributions lies in his ability to combine meticulous archival research with moral clarity. His landmark book, Hand for the Jews, Betrayal and Murder in German-Occupied Poland, published in 2013, translated into multiple languages, including Hebrew, and recipients of Yad Vashem International Book Prize, demonstrated through extensive documentation that the murder of the Jews hiding in the so-called Aryan side was largely the result of local hostility than direct German actions. This data-driven conclusion disrupted entrenched narratives and sparked fierce debate, particularly in Poland, where efforts to whitewash aspects of the past have become, mainly in the past, but also in some places even now, increasingly systematic. Rather than retreat, Professor Grabowski responded in initiating a major collaborative research project investigating Jewish survival strategies across occupied Poland. The result, Dalia's Notes, A Night Without End, co-edited with Professor Barbara Engelking, stands as both a milestone in Holocaust scholarship and a direct response to politically motivated distortion of history. In the face of public attacks, legal actions, and attempts to silence his work, Jan has remained unwavering in his commitment to principled, evidence-based scholarship. Those debates and the backlash they provoked intensified with the publication of his most recent book on duty, the role of the Polish Blue Police and the criminal police in the Holocaust, published by Yad Vashem on 2023, which will be available on Amazon very soon, which examines the active and often zealous role played by Polish police forces in implementing the Nazi genocidal policies. Like his earlier work, it deepened our understanding of local collaboration in the machinery of the genocide and challenged national myth. Beyond those groundbreaking studies, Jan's work is also a powerful example of scholarship that bridge the gap between academic research and public understanding. His co-authored article with Shira Klein, Wikipedia Intentional Distortion of the History of the Holocaust, 2023, exposed systematic manipulation of one of the world's most widely accessed knowledge platform. And in Whitewash, Poland and the Jews, 2024, he explores how historical memory is being reshaped and often distorted for political purposes. Both works reflected his determination to bring honest, fact-based research into the public arena, even when the truth it reveals are deeply uncomfortable. Before I invite Professor Grabowski to speak, I'd like to offer a brief local reflection on some of those challenges that we faced, and Itzik mentioned some other just a few minutes ago. We're living through a pivotal moment in how Holocaust is studied and remembered, not only because the number of survivors is diminishing, but because the meaning of the Holocaust is being reshaped amidst growing political pressure and cultural noise. The danger today is not ignorance, but distortion. The Holocaust is evoked endlessly in media, politics, and protest, often as a blunt metaphor. We hear it everywhere. Hamas are the Nazis, Gaza is Warsaw Ghetto, it's 1933 again. But October 7th is not the Holocaust. We're not living in 1938. And the Holocaust is not a meme, a metaphor, or a political cartoon. The more the Holocaust is invoked in ideological or populist discourse, the more its meaning risks being diluted. Two particularly troubling trends contribute to this erosion. The first seeks to universalize the Holocaust into a vague crime against humanity, detaching it from the specific ideology of Nazi anti-Semitism, its Jewish victims, and the concrete goal of the final solution. This deudization of the Holocaust, often masked as liberal universalism, empties the Holocaust of its historical specificity. The second trend, no less concerning, comes from voices cloaked in the pro-Israeli rhetoric, including those with overt anti-Semitic or racist records, who use the Holocaust to serve political agendas. This form of pseudo-philo-Semitism is willing to blur or erase uncomfortable historical truth, particularly in countries like Poland, Hungary, Romania, and more, and we just hear what's happening in Latvia with Tukos. Both trends, whether in the name of universalism or nationalism, distort the past and dishonor the victims. In this context, historical research becomes not only an academic responsibility, but a moral imperative. As Jan's work reminds us, we must remain vigilant in distinguishing between testimony and myth, between fact and opinion, between scholarship and distortion. Our commitment must be to the facts, not to narratives. And this, I believe, is where Professor Grabowski's contribution becomes most evident. His research exemplifies the idea that historical precision is a commitment, that the ethical responsibility of Holocaust scholarship lies not in what is convenient or popular, but in what is true. And with this, it is my great honor to welcome Professor Jan Grabowski, who will speak today on bystanders of the Holocaust, history, memory, and commemoration. Please.
Well, I don't know what to say after all these wonderful words. Avi, thank you. Yitzhak, thank you for the introduction. Thank you for being here and taking your time on this lovely day to be here at the eve of Yom HaShoah. And I am very privileged and lucky, actually, to be here. As Javi mentioned, being a Holocaust scholar nowadays in Western academic world is not always obvious and not always rewarding in terms of reception, definitely. And I would like to thank you once again for being here, and most of all to Yossi's mother, who is one of the survivors from Poland, about who I will speak a bit today as well. So usually I am, in terms of my public speeches or lectures and talks, I am accused of being the bearer of bad news, and I will try to maintain this tradition. And I think we need to be vigilant, and time for laughter especially is not very well associated with the topic at hand. So, by the way, if you can't hear me, please let me know. If you can hear me, then I'm glad. 11 years ago, I traveled from Ottawa to Jerusalem to receive the Yad Vashem International Book Prize, one of the most gratifying awards which can be bestowed on a historian of the Holocaust by his peers. Yad Vashem, the organizer of the event, asked me to give a talk on a topic of my own choice. Given the focus of my work, which has always been on the relations between Jews and Poles during the Shoah, I proposed the title back then, The Role of Bystanders in the Implementation of the Final Solution in Poland. Today, it feels awkward going back to explore the same issue for a second time after more than a decade. Many things have changed, however, and the history of the Shoah in Poland has been rewritten in ways which I could hardly have anticipated 11 years ago. In my talk at Yad Vashem, I quoted Raoul Hilberg, the founding scholar of Holocaust studies, who divided the human scenery of the Shoah into three categories: the victims, the perpetrators, and the bystanders. In his very important work, he noted, I quote, "Most contemporaries of the Jewish catastrophe were neither perpetrators nor victims. Many people, however, saw and heard something of the event. Those of them who lived in Adolf Hitler's Europe would have described themselves, with few exceptions, as bystanders. They were not involved, not willing to hurt the victims, and not wishing to be hurt by the perpetrators. Yet the reality was not always so uncomplicated. Much depended on the relations of various continental European nations with the Germans and with the Jews. These bonds or fissures could facilitate or hinder action in one direction or another. In some areas, bystanders became perpetrators themselves. In many regions, they took advantage of Jewish misery and seized a profit, but there were also those who helped the hunted." End quote. That's Hilberg proposing his category. The problem with Hilberg's definition is its ambiguity. Bystanders, in some cases, morphed into perpetrators, and in other cases, they became rescuers and not infrequently victims. What makes the bystanders an issue of universal concern is the fact that these hundreds of millions of Europeans and people outside of Europe had to make decisions in the face of the genocide. And nowhere these choices were more stark and needed to be done more frequently than in Poland, where the Holocaust quite literally knocked on the doors of millions of people. Decisions to do something or to do nothing were equally charged and presented these bystanders with moral dilemmas of existential nature for which they were ill-prepared or unprepared at all. Let me begin with an astute observation by my colleague, Dr. Elżbieta Janicka, one of the most insightful Polish cultural anthropologists and a scholar of the Shoah. In her article, Participating Observers, Janicka writes, I quote, "The watchful eye of the non-Jewish majority was something akin to an overseer's scrutiny, and exercised a power that could be defined as le droit de regard, the right of gaze, the right to monitor or supervise. Poles were the second instance. They arbitrated, they decided, they approved the plan designed by the Germans, supplementing it with the lack of alternative. The right of gaze was founded on the right to produce the Jew. Producing the Jew, labeled in Polish as recognizing the Jew, the object of gaze was thus equipped not only with a set of characteristics, but also with an instruction manual." End quote. This instruction manual usually meant death through denunciation to Polish or German police. Both Jews seeking refuge and the bystanding Poles knew this instruction manual by heart. Part 1. Then. Keeping in mind Janicka's definition of participating observers, we need now to go back to 1942. More precisely to September 22nd, 1942, when German Liquidierungskommando, or liquidation units composed of German police, Ukrainian auxiliaries, and Polish blue police, entered the ghettos of Consolidated County, known back then as Kreishauptmannschaft, Sokolov-Węgrow, a remote area situated 60 miles northeast of Warsaw. Now, this is not the best map, but the only one I could locate. So what you have actually, the area that I am going to drag you through is here. This is the consolidated by the Germans, Consolidated County, Sokolov-Węgrow. One of the perhaps best known features of that area is the starting in the summer of 1942, the extermination camp Treblinka II. So, having spent several years conducting microhistorical research in that very area, I became familiar with the physical and human geography of the place, as well as with the Jewish, Polish, and German sources pertinent to the study of the destruction of local ghettos during the Holocaust. The findings have been published in 2018, English edition 2022, in two-volume collective work, which Javi mentioned, Night Without End, which triggered at the time a very hostile reaction of the nationalist Polish authorities and their acolytes. The destruction of the local Jewish communities was linked to Aktion Reinhardt, which began with the Lublin ghetto in March of that year. The liquidations of the ghettos in Sokołów, Węgrów, Stoczek, and Baczki followed the same horrible pattern repeated hundreds of times across Poland. The Germans and the Ukrainians usually operated inside the ghettos, while the Polish Blue Police, all stations of Blue Police in the county have been put on alert the previous day, cordoned the ghettos from outside, preventing the victims from fleeing the liquidation action. Usually, but not always, in the case of open ghettos, such as one in Stoczek Węgrowski on that territory, where Jews remained in their own houses and where the Germans had no idea who lived where, the job of rounding up the victims went to Polish policemen, firefighters, and the mob, eager to loot and rape. More about it in a moment. Jews were hunted down in the streets, driven towards the central assembly point, such as the local marketplace, and then marched toward the nearest railway station. In the case of Jews of Sokołów and Węgrów, their destination was the station in Sokołów Podlaski, while the Jews of Stoczek Węgrowski were marched toward the station in Sadowne. It is important to keep Sadowne in mind, as we will soon revisit the local railway station. From the stations, death trains delivered the Jews to the gas chambers of Treblinka, less than 30 kilometers distant. The liquidation was also a time of unprecedented terror, which is difficult to describe and impossible to comprehend or imagine. The goal of the Germans was to ensure obedience and to render impossible all and any acts of physical defiance on the part of the Jews. Gendarmerie Sergeant Heinrich Auenlauf, involved in the liquidation of a large ghetto to the south, wrote to his fiancée in 1942, I quote, "We fixed the Jews so well that water boiled in their asses out of fear." It's all too often forgotten that during these horrible hours or days, between 10 and 20% of the ghetto inhabitants were killed by the liquidation units. Jews were hunted down in their houses and in the streets. All signs of resistance were quashed without mercy, and those unable to march, mostly the elderly and the children, were apprehended, placed on horse-pulled carts, earlier made available by the elders of surrounding villages, and finally executed by the Germans in the local Jewish cemetery. In the case of Sokołów and Węgrów, at least 3,000 to 4,000 people have thus been murdered in situ on September 22, 1942. This count does not even include the victims in much smaller ghettos in the nearby Stoczek and Baczki. The streets of these towns literally run with blood, as noted by Władysław Okulus, the Polish mayor of Węgrów. To make Jewish survival even less likely, the Liquidierungskommandos were not operating alone. They had assistance coming from various segments of the local Polish population. Sometimes they could best be described as participating observers, and sometimes as active participants in the genocide unfolding around them. Here, the definition proposed by Elżbieta Janicka is of particular value. On September 22, 1942, Topa Szemberg was 3 months old. Abandoned by her Jewish mother on a Węgrów street during the liquidation of the ghetto, she recalled the account left behind by her adoptive parents. I quote, It was in September 1942. I was told I was laying in diapers for 3 nights and no one dared to pick me up. People were afraid. Only a German gendarme brought me milk from time to time. He said that he knew that I was a Jewish child, but he couldn't kill me because he had a similar child back home. On the 4th day, Marianna and Andrzej Ruszkowscy, courageous Polish citizens of Węgrów, picked up the baby and took her home. The decision was a very difficult one because in the eyes of the neighbors, such an act found little understanding and even less sympathy. They said, "You, Mrs. Ruszkowska, you should know what to say to the Germans because they will come to you." End quote. A Jewish baby abandoned in the street, laying in full view of the Polish inhabitants, all of them unwilling or too fearful to save the child. True, the Poles were afraid of German reprisals, but the reprisals will only happen once someone, in this case one's neighbor, reported the offender to the police. And no doubt, someone would report, as called for by the infamous instruction manual earlier invoked by Janicka and known to everybody across the occupied land. This is what exactly le droit de regard, the right of gaze, meant in practice. But enough about participating observers. The next stage of participation in liquidation action involved the acquisition of post-Jewish goods. There is an expression in Polish language, dobra pożydowskie, post-Jewish goods, which at the time were not yet quite post-Jewish enough. From his hiding place, Sewek Fishman witnessed the following scene. I quote, "The Poles cried out, 'Give us your shoes.' And she said, 'Don't you want to wait until they kill me?' At which the German ordered her to take off her shoes. So she slapped the German in the face, and he killed her near the pump. And then the German said to the Poles, 'Now take her shoes.'" End quote. The same Jewish witness commented on the efficiency and brutality of bystanders who, with no warning, became associates in murder. A few of these bystanders trapped his wife, and when she failed to take off her gold earrings as promptly as requested, they tried to cut off her ears together with the prized jewelry. Szraga Fajvel-Bielawski, a Węgrów merchant of modest means but of great ingenuity, observed the liquidation of his ghetto from the hideout. I quote, "Restaurateur Fischel Hudzik dug a hiding place for his family under the floor of his house. When it became too uncomfortable and cramped for them to lie under the floor, Fischel sneaked out at night to a nearby village in search of a new and better hiding place. Before he returned, the Poles combed the house and found his wife Toibe and the girls. They called Giller, the gendarme, who came and dragged the 4 of them out in front of the building. It was close to our store, so we heard every word. The children cried and begged Giller, 'Herr Giller, let us live, you know us. You gave us chocolate. You played with us, you liked us. Please let us live. Please let us live.' Giller yelled, 'Faster, faster.' The oldest of the girls said to her mother, 'I want to live a little longer.' And the mother replied with bitterness, 'No, you will not live because there is no place for you in this world.' The children screamed and cried as they were rushed to the market. A few seconds later, we heard gunshots and everything went quiet. But Bielawski was not quite done yet and continued, I quote, "The screams of the Jews mixed with the shrieks of the Germans and the laughter of the Poles. Children cried out to their mothers, 'Mama, I don't want to die, I don't want to die.' Everyone knew where they would be taken and what would happen to them. Throughout the day, the SS men, with the willing help of the Poles, loaded the Jews onto open trucks which drove off in the direction of Treblinka." End quote. While this was happening, a 17-year-old Edward Witecki helped the gendarmes locate Jewish hideouts. Sometime around 2 p.m., a gendarme known as Hans shot a fleeing Jew in the groin and then handed his rifle to Witecki to finish off the wounded men lying on the street. One of the Polish witnesses recalled after the war in a court, I quote, "Witecki wanted to shoot him through the head from the front, but the Jew boy couldn't stand it and kept writhing on the ground, so that finally Witecki grew bored of the dance and shot him through the head from behind. I saw all of this with my own eyes because it happened right in my backyard," finished the Polish witness. Sadowne is a little village located in the northern part of Kreishauptmannschaft Sokolów-Węgrow, strategically located next to the railway line Warsaw-Małkinia. It was where Adam Starkopf, a Jew with good Aryan looks, as blonde-haired and blue-eyed people were referred to back then, along with his wife and child, lived on Aryan papers among the Polish villagers. And I quote, "The Christmas period of 42 and 43 in Poland was not a period of peace and goodwill. One frosty night in early January 1943, Pella and I had already fallen asleep when we were awakened by the noise of a passing train, followed by machine gun series. We heard the train slow down and stop. I went to the window. Soon neighbors came running over. 'Don't you hear the commotion outside? Some Jews just escaped from the train and the Germans started shooting. They must have hit quite a few. Just think, all these Jews are lying on the ground ready to be taken. We can go out, collect them, and hand them over to the Gestapo.' A few minutes later, we heard moans and screams outside as the wounded Jews were dragged to the snow, to the barns and stables. The hunt continued all night." End quote. Starkopf was not the only one to describe the attitudes of enterprising bystanders from Sadowne. Jan Piechocki was hiding on Aryan papers in Węgrów. In the summer of 1942, he found himself near the station in Sadowne, the same station. He recalled, "Between Ostrówek and Sadowne, there was a freight train standing on a side track. Ukrainian guards were loitering along the wagons, which drew my attention. They shouted at the guys with bottles trying to approach the wagons. Only then did I understand. Through the small windows, through the barbed wire, hands were reaching out for water. The boys were trying to distract the guards and pass the bottles after taking payment. Cries, I could hear cries, 'Kikes, drop us watches.' I stood as if I were hammered into the ground." The attitudes of these Polish bystanders towards the fleeing Jews, as described by Starkopf, Piechocki, are noteworthy, as the railway station in Sadowne was the destination point for the Jews of Stoczek on the day of the liquidation of their ghetto. Part 2, Memory, now. One can see and one can hear, but faintly from behind the curtains and from behind the fence. 11 years ago, when I gave my talk at Yad Vashem awards ceremony, I thought that the painful issues of local complicity, collaboration and collusion in Poland during the Shoah would eventually be resolved, studied sine ira et studio, paving way to an East European equivalent of the phenomenon known in the West as Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the past. The French do it, the Dutch with hesitation do it, the Scandinavians even do it. Even the Swiss started thinking about doing it. Why not the Poles, I thought to myself. Little did I know. The book One Can See and One Can Hear, The Witnesses of the Holocaust in Occupied Poland, has been published a few months ago by the well-respected Polish Center for Holocaust Research. The volume is a result of collective labor made of 13 studies, each written by a different author and loosely tied together by the volume's title. The study penned by Michał Kowalski promises to shed light on the attitudes and actions of the Polish witnesses of the consolidated county, or Kreishauptmannschaft Sokolów-Węgrow, the very same area which has been discussed above during the liquidation actions. According to the Polish and Jewish eyewitnesses cited before, the bystanders in County Sokolów-Węgrow took part in large numbers and in various capacities in the liquidations of the local ghettos. Some stared, exercising the droit de regard, some took off with post-Jewish property, some looked for hidden Jews, and some delivered them into the hands of German executioners, and still others murdered the Jewish neighbors on their own. It came as a surprise, therefore, to learn from the study published by the Polish Center for Holocaust Research the following statements. I quote, "Seen through the prism of the collected testimonies, we see a community which looks at the deportation of the Jews from behind the curtains, through the closed windows, from afar. Poles, closed in their houses, hidden, learn about the fate of their Jewish neighbors, above all, through what they hear. They hear the shots, shouts, quick steps of those who escape, or the sounds of heavy military boots, sounds of broken glass, doors broken down, cries and whining of children and their mothers." And so it goes, I quote. Although one cannot see everything clearly through the curtains, and the testimonies of Polish witnesses are often incomplete, devoid of details and focus, it does not mean that non-Jewish houses were quiet. One cannot escape the incredible cries. One cannot escape even though the great majority of the community outside the ghetto sits in their own houses and waits for it all to end. End quote. This is not a travesty or irony. It's not a tongue-in-cheek narrative. This is history of the Holocaust written today in Poland. Polish bystanders, suddenly deprived of agency, hunkered down in their houses, waiting for the Germans and the Jews to disappear. The title of Kowalski's study, I quote, "It's likely that they will take the Jews to Treblinka, you better stay at home," summarizes the main thesis of the author about the alleged lack of agency of the Polish society when facing the liquidation actions. Interestingly, the quote is taken from an interview conducted in 2018 by the author with an 81-year-old woman who was 5 at the time of the liquidation of the ghetto. I will come back to these late testimonies in a short while. Where are the Poles earlier mentioned by Bielawski who combed the house of innkeeper Fischel Hudzik and who delivered into the hands of gendarme Giller for execution his wife and daughters who begged the German to spare their lives? What happened to Poles who, I quote, "throughout the day helped the SS to load the Jews onto open trucks which drove off in the direction of Treblinka?" Well, they are no longer in the picture, erased, together with Bielawski, the author of these comments, and one of the most important, if not the most important Jewish witness of the destruction of Jewish Węgrów, and the only surviving Jewish witness of the final liquidation of the secondary ghetto in Węgrów in April 1943. Erasing the voice of Jewish witnesses of the destruction of local ghettos is nothing new. In 2018, well before Kowalski, and soon after the publication of Night Without End, the book which I co-published and co-wrote, and its section on the liquidation of Węgrów, the task of whitewashing the Polish bystanders went to a group of concerned and indignant citizens of Węgrów, led by local high school history teacher. Their goal was to defend the good name of the Polish nation, maligned by the long-deceased Jewish shopkeeper and merchant. They penetrated into the post-Jewish house in which Bielawski was thought to have taken shelter in on September 22nd, 1942. In no time, they found the hideout located in the attic and shared their findings with the local press, which you can see here. Actually, Tygodnik Siedlecki is a very respected mainstream publication in eastern parts of Poland. It's not some kind of a right-wing rag that would include these kind of statements. So, and they shared their findings with the local press. Another sensational discovery in Węgrów, the mainstream Tygodnik Siedlecki, Siedlce Weekly, reported à la une on its front page on May 30th, 2018. And I quote, "It turns out that the hiding place in the attic of the store, which Raga Fajvel Bielawski described in his memoirs, The Last Jew of Węgrów," that was the title of his memoir. By the way, I very warmly recommend you have a look at very powerful book. So, described in his memoirs, The Last Jew of Węgrów, really existed. However, it looked completely different from what Bielawski states. The author of the memoirs could not see from the scenes of the complicity of Polish residents of the city in the extermination of their Jewish neighbors, which he so dramatically described. Confronting with the reality of what Bielawski said is downright crushing for him. It turns out that he was either confabulating or simply lied. So here you can see on this picture, this is the face of local high school teacher who simply excavates the Jewish hideout and comes to this conclusion that Bielawski, the Jew, could not see what he noted he saw. The Siedlce Weekly did not explain why would Bielawski lie about the Poles. Most likely the editors thought it was obvious to the readers of the newspaper. After all, one knows that Jews lie. In fact, I quote the article, "The wall was 48 centimeters thick and is impossible to penetrate with an ordinary knife. In addition, on the preserved wall there is not even a sign that someone tried in the mortar between the bricks to poke a hole through which he could have observed what was happening in the marketplace." And so it goes. The dismissal of Jewish testimony is in this case not limited to Bielawski alone. It's a larger and chronologically much older pattern which started to emerge as soon as the war was over. A brief paragraph from a 1949 trial sums up the problem. I quote from the files of Siedlce District Court from 1949. "The witness Hanna Zelizer, at the time of observing the events she described, was a very young person, only 14 years of age, a girl, and was in a state of strong emotional strain caused by the ever-present danger of exposure and therefore imminent death. And under these conditions, she could not make normal and objective observations about the events she observed, and therefore may be mistaken about both the nature and the course of the events, as well as the significance of persons involved." End quote. We read in the justification of a sentence in 1949 trial of Polish firemen accused of taking part in the liquidation of Węgrów ghetto. Indeed, one has to agree with the Polish judge. Very few Jewish witnesses of the liquidation actions were able, under the circumstances, to make normal and objective observations. This attitude towards the Jewish survivor, or non-survivors, testimony survived communism and thrives today in the third decade of the 21st century. The scholars of the Holocaust were long concerned about the fate of the Jewish testimony once the generation of survivors was gone. Their fears were not unfounded. In Poland today, the survivor testimony is being undermined, or, as it happened in the case of recent publication, is being largely omitted following the introduction of allowing the introduction of negationist narrative into the historiographical mainstream through the main door. The goal of the history policy in Poland is to transform the Shoah into a usable history, to quote the expression coined by the late Yehuda Bauer. One of the prominent features of usable history of the Holocaust is to shield and to defend the good name of own nation with little or no regard to the historical evidence available. Historians writing usable history of the Shoah are involved in a process or a phenomenon better known as Holocaust distortion. They don't deny, they just diminish, they distort, they present pars pro toto, and they argue that exceptions were the rule. Kowalski readily admits that some Poles in uniforms were involved in the liquidations of the local ghettos. I quote, "The number of perpetrators, helpers in various actions is difficult to estimate. We only know Chaim Kwiatek's account of 9 Polish firefighters from Stoczek. In Węgrów, groups of firefighters and policemen, according to trial testimony, may have numbered up to 30. So they were in a minority in the units designated for direct deportation," end quote. Oh, really? In fact, all posts of blue police across the 2 consolidated counties took part in liquidation actions. As for Chaim Kwiatek of Stoczek, population 1,200 Jews and 500 Poles, who was 17 in 1942, he watched the death of his shtetl and his family from his hideout in the barn. His is the only testimony from the ghetto in Stoczek. According to Kowalski, Kwiatek mentions 9 Polish firefighters taking part in the action. According to his testimony, a part of them, the liquidation action, involved only 70 Germans, guards, police officers. This is a particularly awful violation of the source. No, Kwiatek's testimony, filed right after the war, so casually and so briefly invoked by the author here, does not mention only 9 Polish firefighters taking part in the action. According to Kwiatek, Germans and Ukrainians stopped at the gates of the town while Poles searched the hideouts. It was the Poles who gave the Germans a list of all the Jews living in Stoczek. Given the fact that there was no ghetto in Stoczek and that Jews and Poles lived side by side, a nominative list was of particular importance. Kwiatek not only saw the unfolding tragedy from up close, but was also familiar with all the Poles who over the course of few hours mutated from neighbors, classmates and friends into murderers and the accomplices of murderers. As Kwiatek wrote, the chief responsibility lay with Łaszyński, the local village elder, and 70 other murderers. The 70 murderers were not Germans, as Kowalski argues. They were other Poles who joined in the search for the Jews and helped to seize 500 of their neighbors, who later that day have been delivered to the railway station in Sadowne. And what happened at the railway station in Sadowne and in its vicinity, we have already heard. When we look at this publication, we no longer see the gokers, the robbers, the snitches, and the killers. All are gone from the picture, no longer tarnishing the good name of the nation. What is left is a sad story, a German and Jewish story with which Poles have little in common. Bystanders stand by, helpless and traumatized, and observe the Jewish tragedy which takes place behind their windows, curtains, and fences. What about the situation in the vicinity of railway stations and along the railway tracks cutting through the territory of the consolidated county? Did Adam Starkop's testimony fare any better than the testimony of Fajvel Szraga-Bielawski? Not really. Starkop, Polish peasants hunting down the Jews around railway tracks, all this has also been erased and purged from the account. Instead, the new usable account treats us to Polish witness who had a markedly different perception of the past. I quote, "Since July 1942, the drama of those who tried to flee the transports played itself out around the railway station in Sokołów Podlaski," we read in Kowalski's account. On the stations, along the railway lines, the SS men stood on the roofs of the wagons. When someone jumped from such a transport, tearing away at the barbed wire, they jumped from the moving transport. They were shot at. Once such a train passed, they lay there killed. End quote. What was the role of Polish peasants in this horrible story? Well, according to Kowalski, all the local peasants had to do was to bury the dead. I quote, "Village elders ordered the inhabitants of local villages to arrange the burials. The graves, or rather pits, quickly dug out in the dirt, remained anonymous. Nevertheless, in July 1942, Jewish death was present all around the area. Everybody was in touch with it. It could be an ocular perception or a physical contact when the peasants buried the bodies in makeshift pits." End quote. What about the uncounted Jews who made it past German bullets? What were their chances of survival? What about all the Jews robbed, raped, and killed by the local peasants along the railway tracks? No, nothing. This is how usable history replaces history, just as bad coinage replaces good coinage. Commemoration, the Maletka affair. The rewriting of the history of bystanders goes beyond the rejection of Jewish survivor testimony. It increasingly relies on recently created non-Jewish testimonies and accounts of dubious value. These late testimonies include interviews usually referenced as being in the possession of the author, which means difficult if not impossible to access, constructed with the help of unknown methodology and obtained from people who at the time of the Shoah were small children. Without leaving the consolidated county Sokołów-Węgrów, one can take a look at the writings of Elżbieta Albiniak, a historian and a Catholic nun. Her recent work deals with the Polish-Jewish relations in Sterdyn, a large village located 20 kilometers east of Treblinka, where, before the war, Jews formed close to 90% of local population. Albiniak's research is based in part on these late testimonies, interviews conducted in 2019, featuring old people who at the time of the Shoah were small children. Unsurprisingly, one would look in vain in these accounts for any signs of Polish complicity. Holocaust is a German and Jewish story, with frightened Poles looking helplessly from the sidelines at German bestiality, or, as proposed by Kowalski, looking from behind the curtains and fences. It so happens that Treblinka extermination camp and the site of the former Treblinka railway station is also located on the territory of our county. Between July 1942 and September 1943, the railway station in Treblinka was a doorway to hell. 900,000 Jews transited through the station on their last journey to the gas chambers of extermination camp Treblinka II, located 3 kilometers away. Out of the 900,000, 100 survived, give or take a dozen. A few of them left written accounts of their ordeal, and all mentioned the ubiquitous presence of cellars of water surrounding the wagons, with thousands of people dying of thirst inside the burning hot cattle wagons. Jankiel Wiernik, caught in a manhunt in a Warsaw ghetto, recalled his arrival on Treblinka station. The train moved in the morning and we rolled into Treblinka railway station. It was a hot day. We could hardly breathe. We were horribly thirsty. I looked out of the window. The peasants brought water and asked for 100 zlotys per bottle. I had no money, other than few silver coins, so I had to forego water. Others, however, paid the money. Eddie Weinstein from the town of Łosice arrived at Treblinka station on August 25, 1942, one day after Wiernik. He described the situation on the ramp. I quote, "We were horribly thirsty and we had no idea what would happen to us. But even in these circumstances, money and jewelry even so were still appreciated. The Poles who worked on the station came to an SS soldier and asked him for permission to bring water to the thirsty people. The soldier gave his consent. So they brought buckets of water close to the wagons and started filling empty bottles handed over by the passengers. For this, they wanted good payment. They clearly considered Polish bills worthless, and they only took hard currency and precious objects such as rings and brooches. Without them, it was impossible to get water. These merciful Poles split the profits with soldiers. Someone in our wagon gave them a few gold coins, and in return we received a real treasure, a small bucket of water." End quote. Abram Jakub Krzepicki found himself at the railway station in Treblinka on 26th of August 42, a day after Eddie Weinstein. Well, the same story. I could multiply these stories. There are other Jewish testimonies from the railway station in Treblinka, but all agree that for the local railway workers who could gain access to death trains, this was a real El Dorado, a mythical city of gold in this remote corner of Poland. Can we call these enterprising Polish railway workers bystanders to the Holocaust? I think not. Profiteers, German facilitators, opportunistic leeches preying on human suffering. This is just a handful of expressions which come to mind. Right? Wrong. In 2021, in the place of horror and suffering of 900,000 Jews, the Polish state, with the help of Polish historians, erected a monument to honor Jan Maletka, a Polish railway worker who, as the authorities claim, has been shot by the Germans for delivering the water to the dying. Maletka was killed at the Treblinka station in August 1942. That much we know. The idea behind the monument is based on the premise that the railway worker acted not out of greed, but driven by altruistic impulse, for which he paid with his life. All that's needed to substantiate this claim is to reject the existing Jewish testimonies, to gloss over the survivor narratives, to cherry-pick more palatable paragraphs and phrases, building up a usable history to corroborate a altogether improbable scenario. This is being done nowadays in a routine way as a matter of fact. Having eliminated the offending Jewish memory, one can later lean on the late testimonies to provide the desired context, or one can reach out for less than reputable sources, which abound. Let's take, for instance, the 1989 book titled Martyrs of Charity, edited and co-written by one Wacław Zajączkowski, whose stated goal is, I quote, the author defend the good name of Polish nation while refuting the unjustified accusations raised by the Jewish circles. Martyrs of Charity is a blatantly hagiographical book devoid of any academic standards, written to elevate Polish national heroism and suffering. Central part of this book is filled with an essay by Jędrzej Giertych, the grandfather of Polish anti-Semites. Giertych's essay, entitled Judeo-Polonia, is a handbook of tropes, cliches, and obsessions of a sick anti-Semitic mind. This is the context in which Zajączkowski invoked his conversation held in 1983 with Maletka's wartime companion, who mentioned the fact that Maletka wanted to help the Jews, end quote. That's all. That's the source which helped to rebrand the human leeches and German helpers of Treblinka railway station into Polish paragons of Christian piety, willing to save the Jews at the cost of their own lives. Conclusion. How can we reconcile usable history of the Holocaust with the history of the Holocaust? We cannot. Fajvel Szlaga-Bielawski and a few members of his family survived the war, a rare feat in Poland where 1% of Jews lived to see the arrival of Soviet forces. Once the Red Army liberated his native Węgrów, Bielawski left his hideout. It was, I quote him, it was mid-September 1944. At 4 o'clock, we nervously left the barn to return to Węgrów. We were nervous because we were returning to a town which was, as the Nazis said, Judenrein, cleansed of the Jews. We had no idea what such a town would offer us. Who would we talk to? All our close friends and relatives were dead. Should we open our store for business as usual and chat with the customers as they came in? Hello, how are you? Lovely day. How are you? How is your wife and the little ones? Could I open the shop and return to business as usual, forgetting everything what happened? What do you say to murderers? How would the Polish people of Węgrów react to seeing my family back in town? Would they come up to me and tell me how sorry they were and how tragic it all was? Would they ignore us? Would they try to kill us to keep us from telling the world what really happened? I don't know. But one thing was certain, I would never forget. And continuing. I waited to see if any Jews would arrive to go to the synagogue for afternoon and evening services and to listen to an itinerant rabbi. No one appeared. We saw only the Poles who so recently had wanted to kill us and rob us. They passed us and looked impudently at us. I almost envied the dead. They no longer had to look at the faces and they no longer had to look at the faces of murderers. End quote. The only way to prop up and to maintain the precarious construct of usable history is to silence the offending Jewish voices, and not infrequently Polish voices too. In his 1874 essay on the use and abuse of history for life, Friedrich Nietzsche wrote about history and as a useful tool to construct group identity, or a means toward a greater goal, the betterment of culture. Too much scholarship and too much knowledge could be detrimental to these goals, wrote the German philosopher. What mattered most, he said, was not sound methodology, but whether the historian's work served to enrich contemporary life and culture. Too much of history, wrote Nietzsche, was a dangerous thing. One needs to determine the degree of history and through that the borderline at which the past must be forgotten if it's not to become the grave digger of the present, end quote. Later he added, I quote, for the health of a single individual, a people, and a culture, the unhistorical and the historical are equally essential. Too much history can be a grave digger of the present, and unhistorical can be essential to our cultural well-being. This rather utilitarian view of history has always been present in historical thinking, although it suffered the setbacks. Today it runs strong. Its presence is perhaps felt even more so than in the past. It's particularly true in the case of the Holocaust, one of the this part of history most exposed to the mounting pressures of politics and ideology. Rewriting history of the Shoah in order to reinforce national myths is not limited to Poland. it has become a pan-national phenomenon which acquires momentum with the passage of time. If left unchecked, uncontested, usable history of the Holocaust will, in due course, soon replace history of the Shoah. Thank you.
So what can we do?
Well, you know, the thing is that what can we do? It's a loaded question. Before October 7, I would say, you know, do research, publish, educate, and we see that education, which has been so, we would say, broadly distributed and given, led to nothing practically. Never again is again, and there will be tomorrow, right? What to do? I mean, in my case, my role is easier. As a historian, I will keep digging. Thanking for this invitation to the Institute. I will be here pursuing my current research project, regardless of what happens. But we have to be simply very vigilant. And the problem is that this kind of usable history is gaining ground. That's for certain. If you look at the polls of public opinion, people want nice, domesticated history, and they don't like Jews all that much. So if you can replace the sad history of Jewish catastrophe with the story of good Gentiles saving people, then that's already, you know, part of our defeat and their success. Please.
Thank you so much for this lecture. So I want to follow up on your on what you said, that people don't like Jews. People also don't like Poles. And my question is about the context and the moral obligations of historians. I have no doubts that in Poland it is necessary and essential to speak about Polish collaboration with the Nazis and the Polish part in the Holocaust. But living in Israel for the last 12 years, I have opportunity to have like tens of talks to Israelis, and people here hate Poles more than they hate Jews. And this is psychological, and because Poles were neighbors, because we knew them, and Germans were an outside force, and it's enforced by the years of the Holocaust trips.
I mean, you are an educator, right?
I'm an educator. I'm a historian and educator.
And this is actually what makes the whole difference, because what I'm advocating is to stick to the facts. And if the facts are painful, then that's very problematic, and this is a painful thing, but it has to be somehow digested. So if someone doesn't like someone because they read something, as long as it's a well-written history based on factual account, then let it be. If we are talking about the Poles, about the Dutch, or about French, we need a clear account. Now, of course, it will make people very often angry, or it can even strike their prejudice. As a historian, I have, let's say, I am aware of this fact. I'm not going to change my writing because of it. I had this discussion in Poland many times, but you will increase anti-Polish feelings in Israel. To which I answer, I'm very sorry, I produce not something which is going to please people, but this what I, let's say, see in a historical record. So once I had a meeting with a colleague of mine, Professor Michał Bilewicz, a well-known Polish psychologist who is working, a Jewish fellow himself, who is working on this rapprochement between Poles and the Jews, and he said to me in an open way, "Or you are spoiling my work." I said yes, and I'm actually, if I will continue to spoil your work. So it's not the question of ideological bent, it's the question of simply writing what you see. And if the consequences make your life as educator more difficult, I'm still not going to apologize for it.
No, I'm not asking you to apologize. I'm just asking for, maybe I should frame my question differently. If changing the context of where you do research, your research interest switch, like if the focus of your research becomes different when when you change from very anti-Jewish and nationalistically Polish context to a very Jewish and anti-Polish context. That's
But still, it has nothing to do with my work, really. I mean, the problem, I understand that there are the problem is why, for instance, so many people in Israel hold very strongly anti-Polish views. Well, answer yourself this question. These are the people who survived the Holocaust in Poland, and they conveyed the message to their children and to their grandchildren, right? And this message was not very optimistic one. It was built on, you mentioned it, of course, disappointment, huge disappointment, but also on personal suffering. The Germans, the 90% of Jews killed in Poland were killed by the Germans, but these people have no voice, right? They are dead in gas chambers of Treblinka, Auschwitz, and elsewhere. People the 30,000 actually who survived in absolutely horrifying circumstances, which they were able to, let's say, give account of once they came to Israel. Yes.
Is it possible to make a comparison between Poland and other lands in occupied Europe?
These comparisons are very difficult because the situation was so different. What I would say in the context of today's talk, the reaction to Holocaust can be compared. In other words, how today's societies are dealing with the memory of the Holocaust. Because it's not that I or other historians accuse the Polish society. No, these are people who are dead for decades. I mean, no one of people that I write about is alive anymore, practically no one. The thing is how a society can deal with painful memory, and this is something that we can discuss. And here, of course, in Poland, the rejection of historical record, I would say, is the strongest for one simple reason. The Germans never had a political project for Poland. Unlike the case of Ukraine or Baltic states. So if you were murdering Jews, you were not doing it to further, let's say, chances for independent Poland in the future. You were doing it for a variety of different reasons, and Poland has been built on this ethos of own high moral ground during the occupation. So in Ukraine or in Latvia or Lithuania, people know that they had their SS divisions fighting with the Germans. Nothing like this was present in Poland. So if you have this double victimhood clashing one against another, it provokes fireworks which you can appreciate in these circumstances.
Maybe one more. Are there in Poland any Stolpersteine as there are in other places?
Question is about Stolpersteine. Those are, perhaps for those of you who don't know, the little brass insertions in sidewalks that commemorate Jews who lived in the local building during the war with a short note to what happened to them. Well, there are few of them, very few, but general policy, my family tried actually to have a few Stolpersteine for our dead people inserted in the pavement of Kraków. We have been shown the door immediately. The thing is that there are some in few cities I was encouraged to read, but the general policy is one of no Stolpersteine in Poland. Well, this would make Jewish memorial presence overwhelming. And this is the last thing that authorities, regardless of their political hue, want to see.
I can add because I studied Stolpersteine all over Europe.
Okay.
Sorry. And I was in Poland in some installations, but mainly in the periphery. In the periphery...
Especially in Western Poland, I think.
No, it was in the east.
Okay.
Because in these little villages, the central government doesn't rule so hardly.
Okay.
So it's on a local base that there are installation of stones. I was in about five different villages, without the knowing of the government or whatever.
Well, what we were told, my family not so many years ago, that if we really that Stolpersteine are contrary to Polish memorial tradition, that you should not insert memorial anything in the sidewalks and trample over with your feet over it. If we really wanted some kind of a plaque, perhaps in English. Because the Jews are no longer in Poland, so they come from Israel, so they can read in English. So that was the response of
That
the...
was in Polish.
That was, yeah.
Historical
No,
studies.
I mentioned there are some exceptions,
Yeah,
there are a
yeah.
few, but the policy was, or is very, I would say, hostile to the...
Yeah.
Okay, I have a question. I understand that there were few words that were devised and used just to make it what happened during the Second World War to the Jews different from other tragedies, like Holocaust and genocide. And this was a specific word that it was entered into vocabulary.
Which one?
Both.
Okay, Holocaust. Mhm.
And today, those words are being used
Oh, yeah.
against us.
Yeah.
And my question is, should we come up with new definitions?
No, I don't think that the thing is that indeed there is a constant stream, I would say, of attempts to kidnap the word Holocaust and turn it around. It's called Holocaust inversion, or applied against the Jews, for instance, as perpetrators of a Holocaust. So this is, I think that it needs to be repeated once again and again and again, that this particular expression deals with one particular historical event. And let other people invent other words to describe different events. But I guess as a historian, I would be deeply offended if I were to admit to such a invasion or appropriation, rather. Yes, please.
Do you think that Christianity, the religion in small villages, had to do with how they treated the Jews?
Yes.
In the big towns, but there was no intelligence. Do you see a difference?
When you are talking about 1930s, 1940s, the population is deeply religious in Catholic sense, both in the cities and in the countryside, perhaps more so in the countryside. The difference is simply lack of anonymity in the rural areas and some anonymity in the cities. But of course, the impact of so-called religious anti-Semitism was a constant, and when we look at hundreds of Jewish testimonies, you can find that the most dangerous day of the week for Jews in hiding was, as you can guess, Sunday, where their host came back from the church upset and furious because the local priest was quite likely to say that, you know, there are some people helping Jews, which is not exactly okay. And the most dangerous week of the year was of course Easter. So I mean, this is so-called anecdotal evidence, but a lot of these anecdotes, so to say, are in the memoirs. Yes, please.
Maybe you could tell us something about the situation of the Pius X Brotherhood in Poland, and right? I mean, Polish Catholicism was not always totally against Jews in the Holocaust. I think around the 90s, the early 1990s, there was a little bit of a movement, maybe with Stanislaw Muszał, but his voice was completely pushed.
But he was purged. I mean, there was always a faction in the Catholic Church in Poland. We can call them enlightened people, and they always were in minority. I met Muszał, I met. But even they were very prudent, and there is. I had several meetings with let's say more enlightened members of the Catholic Church, and they felt very much like a besieged fortress. So it was a very small fortress, but of course there were attempts. But last 15 years was a steady departure. And if you look at the massive support offered by the Catholic hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church to most nationalistic parties in Poland and most absurd ideas. You will come to the conclusion that there is indeed a very long way to go. But mind you, I'm not a specialist in the history of the Catholic Church's attitude to anti-Semitism, so I don't want to go any further
Maybe I
with
can
this.
just specify, Lishitsky has been publishing these enormous books, you know, like the myth of the older brothers, who killed Jesus.
Sorry, could you repeat the name?
Lishitsky.
Okay.
Pavel Lishitsky,
Yeah,
I believe.
Lishitsky.
Grabowski has been writing the introductions.
Yeah, this is the editor-in-chief of this right-wing.
But these are positions that are supposedly anti-Catholic even.
Right. No, but as I mentioned, I can. I would rather I feel much more comfortable in the times of war, and let's say as a historian of the Holocaust, don't want. Probably you know more about this than I do, so I prefer to not to go any further. Yes, please.
I was given at the age of 2 to a Polish Christian family. My earliest memory would be from the age of 3. Being beaten severely by the neighborhood children, being called Żydówka, Jew. I couldn't understand why they called me such a name. I was the daughter of these 2 people. Didn't make sense. When we would go to church on Sunday, without fail, every Sunday, we would hear from the clergy, brothers and sisters, how fortunate we are to have a Savior amongst us who is getting rid of the vermin. The Savior was Hitler, the vermin were the Jews. That's what I learned about the Jews. When I was 6, I was turned in by a neighbor to the Gestapo, and they said I was a Jew. So a firing squad, 6 years old, a firing squad of 30 rifles come to shoot a 6-year-old. The only one that knew that I was a Jew was these 2 people that took me in. She's trying to convince the leader, this is my daughter. You know I wouldn't help you with the save the Jews. We were helping you kill them. And finally said, no, this is a firing squad, we've got a job to do. This Christian Polish woman came to that wall, picked me up, and said that you'll have to shoot us both. So I was obviously quite fortunate that I had angels that took me in. 2017, we went back to Poland, and I spoke to several Poles. We didn't know what was going on, I was told. This was news to us. 2017.
Well, thank you very much for sharing it. Actually, I think I will knock on your door to note to take note of your recollection.
Maybe I'll just say regarding anti-Semitism and anti-Polonism that on the joint declaration of the Polish Prime Minister and the Israeli Prime Minister in 2018, there were many problematic aspects. One of them was an attempt to equalize. It was done very clearly. Anti-Semitism is equal to anti-Polonism, which is a very new term, mainly used by right-wing in Poland, and despite problems about Polish image within Israel or Jews, this is something different, I think, from anti-Semitism, many times called as the longest hatred. Not that the Holocaust, everything in the Holocaust can be explained by anti-Semitism. It could be greed, fear, many other things. We know that the Holocaust was implemented in places that there were no Jewish hatred before, but maybe this connects us back to what Itzik said in the beginning. Some anti-Semitism has many faces, has many problems. It's different from many other challenges. And unfortunately, some of its faces were still challenging today. But I think it's a time for all of us to thank you for just a wonderful experience.
Thank you very much.